When I think of Catholics, I think of two biblical figures in particular, Mary, the Mother of God, and Peter, the first pope. In this video, I just want to publicly share my beliefs about St. Peter, what they used to be when I was a Catholic, and how they've changed and what they are now that I'm not Catholic anymore. When I was Catholic, I believed in the following 5 claims about Peter. First, that Peter existed as a real historical person. Second, that we have some of Peter's authentic writings in the form of the Petrine epistles. 3, that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. 4, that Peter was martyred at Rome via crucifixion upside down. And 5, that we have the bones of St. Peter today. Let's take a look at each one of these and see where I stand now. Claim number 1. Peter existed as a real historical person. So I still do believe this one. I think we have really good evidence that Peter existed as a historical person. Obviously, we have all of the references to Peter in the Gospels, but if you know me, you know that I don't really look at the Gospels, or Acts for that matter, as history. I look at them as literature. But I do look at the epistles like they're history, and Peter is mentioned in the epistle. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul calls Peter his counterpart. Paul says that Peter is an apostle to the uncircumcised, and that Peter is one of the pillars of the church, alongside James and John. But then when Paul is done gassing up Peter, he recounts the time that he got into a fight with Peter at Antioch, saying, "When, however, Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face." And it would be kind of tough to oppose somebody to his face if that person didn't exist as a real historical person. And there's extra biblical sources for the historical existence of Peter as well. In particular, I think about the first letter of Clement, which is pre-100 AD. So that's like the earliest extra biblical source for just about anything, and it mentions Peter. The Pauline and the Clementine letters are enough to convince me that a historical Peter existed. But what about claim number 2, that we have some of Peter's own writings in his own words? I don't think that we actually have the words of Peter himself anymore, though I am sympathetic to the idea that we have something close-ish. In chapter 33 of An Introduction to the New Testament, Father Raymond Brown lays down arguments for and against the authenticity of the authentic Petrine authorship of the first Petrine epistle. Father Brown says that the author was possibly Peter, using a secretary, but more likely a disciple carrying on the heritage of Peter at Rome. That's from page 706. Father Brown lists 6 reasons why he thinks it's more likely that Peter didn't write 1 Peter himself. First, the excellent quality of the Greek, exhibiting a rich vocabulary, and the citation of the LXX form of the Old Testament makes it unlikely that 1 Peter was composed by a Galilean fisherman. Also, 1 Peter 5:12 may indicate that Silvanus was the secretary who wrote this down, so that point isn't, as strong as the rest. The second reason is the dependence of 1 Peter on Pauline writings. The third is the reference to the fiery ordeal, or the experience of suffering required of the brotherhood throughout the world, suggests a universal imperial persecution, of which there was really none during Peter's lifetime. Fourth, the church organization implied in chapter 5, with the established presbyters seemingly appointed and salaried, fits the last 1/3 of the century, which is after Peter's lifetime. Fifth, the writer calls himself Peter rather than Simon or Simon Peter. This appears to be the mark of a disciple, stressing the authority implicit in the symbolic designation. And lastly, the calling of Rome as Babylon, which wasn't really a thing until after the year 70, years after Peter's death. In terms of 2 Peter, Father Brown lists this one as just plain old pseudonymous. He says on page 766, "In discussing 1 Peter, we saw that serious scholars supported Simon Peter as the writer, through a scribe, even if the odds somewhat favored pseudonymity. A comparison of 1 Peter and 2 Peter shows that the same writer did not compose both works, as noted already by Jerome in the 4th century. For instance, there are Old Testament quotations in 1 Peter, but not in 2 Peter. Some 60% of the vocabulary from 2 Peter is not found in 1 Peter. The style of 2 Peter is more solemn, even pompous and labored, and the mindset about issues like the second coming is quite different. That, plus factors to be discussed about dating in the section below, makes it clear that 2 Peter is pseudonymous, written presumably by someone in the Petrine tradition. Indeed, the pseudonymity of 2 Peter is more certain than that of any other New Testament work. Nobody seriously claims that anything other than the Petrine epistles were written by Peter, and since I don't think that either of those were actually written by Peter, I no longer think that we have any of Peter's original words. Third claim, Peter was the first bishop of Rome. I still do believe this one. Strictly speaking, I believe that Peter was the leader of the church at Rome, and that's close enough to the first bishop or first pope to me. Irenaeus of Lyon, about 180 AD, agrees that Peter served in Rome. Tertullian in 195 AD declares that Peter was in Rome. Dionysius of Corinth around 200 says that Peter was leading the church in Rome. And it just makes sense to me that Peter would lead the church wherever he was, especially if Paul wasn't there. Peter, being one of the pillars that Paul points out, definitely would have a place of leadership wherever he was. And if he just so happened to be in Rome as his place of more or less permanent residence, then he's the leader of the church at Rome. And if the pope is just whoever holds Peter's office, then yeah, Peter's the first pope. Next up is the claim that Peter was martyred in Rome via crucifixion upside down. This is a funny one to me. I used to believe all of this claim, and now I believe like half of it. I still do think that Peter died in Rome, and that he was martyred. Maybe he was killed by crucifixion, but I don't think that he was crucified upside down. Let's go back to 1 Clement. 1 Clement was written only a little after the epistles, and probably earlier than some of the Gospels, almost definitely earlier than John. 1 Clement 5 reads as follows: Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors, and when he had suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Perfect. We have first century evidence of Peter's martyrdom. The information about Peter's martyrdom location does not come until around 100 years after Peter's death in Tertullian's Scorpion, in which Tertullian claims that Peter was martyred at Rome during the reign of Nero. But a death location is mundane enough. Everybody who's died has been somewhere when they died. And we know that Peter was leading the church in Rome, so it just makes a lot of sense to me that if Peter was martyred and Peter was leading the church in Rome at the time that he was being martyred, he was probably martyred at Rome. What about the crucifixion part? Well, Tacitus in his Annals describes the persecution of Christians under Nero, though he does not specifically mention Peter. He says that Christians were, quote, torn by dogs, nailed to crosses, or doomed to flames and burnt. The death of Peter is attested to by Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century or perhaps early 3rd century in his prescription against heretics, noting that Peter endured a passion like that of the Lord, where Paul was crowned with a death like John's. This statement implies that Peter was killed by crucifixion and Paul was killed by beheading, like Jesus and John, respectively. So this is 120 plus years after the death of Peter. But again, we know that the Romans like to make examples of religious leaders and other people that they deem worthy of execution. And crucifixion was a particularly brutal way to make an example out of somebody. So it makes sense to me that Peter was crucified, though I'm less certain about this than the fact that he was just martyred in general. But why am I not convinced that Peter was crucified upside down? Well, that's because this claim seems to have originated in an apocryphal story called the Acts of St. Peter. Written in the late 2nd century, this work is actually older than some of the works that I quoted earlier in this video. So if I'm willing to accept the works of Irenaeus and Tertullian and Dionysius, why am I not willing to accept the historicity of the Acts of St. Peter? Hint, it's not because it's not canonical and it's not in the Bible. I don't actually care about canonicity at all. It's because the story is clearly literature, not history. It's a clear callback to the prophet Elijah's confrontation with the priests of Baal as depicted in the Old Testament's Book of Kings. This story is super, super weird. In it, Peter confronts Simon the magician. So Simon Peter confronts Simon the magician, the battle of the two Simons. And Simon claims to have power from God. He claims that his power comes from the same God that Peter worships and the Christians worship. And Simon the magician claims that God will give him the power to fly. Simon the magician says, "For tomorrow I shall forsake you, godless and impious that ye are, and will fly up unto God, whose power I am, though I am become weak. Whereas then ye have fallen, I am he that standeth, and I shall go up to my Father." Well, the next day, a great multitude assembled at the sacred way to see Simon the magician flying, and he amazed the multitudes by flying. But Peter that convicted him was then not yet living at Rome, which city he thus deceived by illusion, so that some were carried away by him or amazed by him. So then this man, standing on a high place, beheld Peter and began to say, "If thy God is able, let it appear at this time." And Peter, seeing the strangeness of the sight, cried unto the Lord Jesus Christ, "If thou suffer this man to accomplish that which he hath set about, now will all they that have believed on thee be offended. Hasten thy grace, O Lord, and let him fall from the height and be disabled. Let him not die, but be brought to naught, and break his leg in 3 places." And he fell from the height, and broke his leg in 3 places. Then every man cast stones at him and went home, and thenceforth believed Peter. The story doesn't quite end there. Simon the magician is brought to a doctor where he died during surgery trying to save his life. So Peter's prayer was answered. Simon the magician did not die from the fall. He died from surgery. This is a very strange story, one that is clearly literature, not history. And guess what? This is quite similar to a bunch of the other apocryphal books, and it's in the same genre as the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. People like Origen and Jerome claim that Peter was crucified upside down, but they are writing decades and centuries, respectively, after the death of Peter and well after the Acts of Peter had been in circulation. So I think that people like Origen and Jerome were influenced by the tradition surrounding the Acts of Peter. While I think it's quite possible that Peter was crucified, I think he was definitely martyred, but I don't think that he was crucified upside down. Lastly, there's the claim that we have the bones of St. Peter today. I did believe this when I was still Catholic, but there is no reliable history of Peter's burial. The accounts of his death that we have are all decades, if not centuries, after his death, and none mention his burial until around the year 250, when we get a few different accounts of where and how St. Peter was buried. Chapter 5 of St. Peter in Rome and His Tomb on the Vatican Hill by Arthur Stapleton Barnes is called Wandering of St. Peter's Body, and, though this book was published in 1900, contains some good information about the different accounts. And since it's so old, it's free to read. The link is in the description down below. Isn't the internet so cool? In the 1940s, there was some excavation work that turned up some bones under the Vatican. The original excavator thought nothing of the bones, but an excavator named Margherita Garducci in the 1960s wrote a piece about why she thought that the bone fragments, none of which were longer than 6 inches, can be attributed to St. Peter. I have the link to Garducci's write-up down below, but even the Vatican seems reluctant to straight up say these are definitely the bones of St. Peter. In 1968, Pope Paul VI said, "The relics of St. Peter have been identified in a way that we can consider convincing." In 2013, Archbishop Reno Fischella said, "It doesn't matter if archaeologists one day definitively determine that the bones aren't Peter's," saying that Christians have prayed at St. Peter's tomb for 2 millennia and will continue to do so, regardless of the findings. It's not as if pilgrims will go to the altar of Peter's tomb and think that in that moment in which they profess their faith, below them are the actual relics of St. Peter or of another still, he told reporters. They go there to profess the faith. To the best of my knowledge, scientific tests that compose the, quote, way that in which we consider this convincing haven't been performed, or if they have been, none of those tests have been made public. And I'm fairly skeptical that they ever will be, given how reluctant the Vatican has been to submit further tests on things like the Shroud of Turin or the Tomb of Guadalupe or the various Eucharistic miracles. So while I do think it's possible that the bones belong to St. Peter, I just don't think it's likely. And I think that the church knows this and kind of doesn't care. It's not that the authenticity of the relics matters, says the church. It's the money that the relics bring in. I mean, it's the piety that those relics inspire. This was a long one, so I'm happy to leave it here for now. Catholics, do I believe more or less about St. Peter than you would have expected me to? I'm sure that you disagree with me in some places, and I'm looking forward to talking about it in the comment section down below. Thanks, everybody.